there is a map that was drawn before the war. Not just before, decades before. In some versions of the story, you could look at an ethnographic map of Yugoslavia from the 1940s, from the 1960s, from the 1980s, and predict, with uncomfortable precision, where the killing would happen. Not because the map caused the killing, because the map showed something that the political structure of Yugoslavia was designed to ignore: the gap between where people lived and where the borders were drawn. Yugoslavia was a federation of 6 republics. The borders between those republics were drawn in 1943 and 1945 by the AVNOJ, the Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, as part of the wartime political arrangement that brought Tito's partisans to power. The borders were designed, in part, to prevent any single nationality from dominating the federation. Serbia was divided by giving Kosovo and Vojvodina autonomous status within it. Croatia contained a large Serb minority in the Krajina region. Bosnia was kept as a single republic, even though no single community had a majority within it. The logic was deliberate. Tito's Yugoslavia was built on the idea of brotherhood and unity, bratstvo I jedinstvo, which required that no republic be a clean expression of a single ethnic identity. The borders were drawn to ensure ethnic mixture, to prevent ethnic homogeneity, to create a federation in which every republic needed the others. In theory, this was a sophisticated answer to the problem of ethnic nationalism in a multi-ethnic space. In practice, it created a different kind of problem. It created a map in which the political borders and the demographic borders did not match. When the federation held together, this mismatch was a source of stability. Everyone was a minority somewhere. Everyone needed the federal structure. No one could secede cleanly. When the federation broke apart, the mismatch became a map of future wars. Because the question that the 1991 breakup immediately raised, the question that the ethnographic map had been showing for decades, was, if the Republican borders become international borders, what happens to the people who are on the wrong side of them? That question cost approximately 140,000 lives to answer. The map knew the question would be asked. Nobody in power wanted to read the map. Here is what the history books tell us. Yugoslavia fell apart because of the rise of ethnic nationalism, the economic crisis of the 1980s, the weakness of the federal institutions after Tito's death in 1980, and the exploitation of those conditions by nationalist politicians. Above all, Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, Franjo Tudjman in Croatia, and the parties that emerged in Slovenia, Bosnia, and elsewhere. The wars that followed were the result of political choices made by specific people. They were not inevitable. They were not written in the geography. They were the product of political actors who chose to mobilize ethnic identities as a political instrument at a moment when the federal structure that had managed those identities was weakening. That is the textbook version. And it is not wrong. The choices mattered. The individuals mattered. The political decisions of 1990 and 1991 were not predetermined by the ethnic map of Yugoslavia. But here is what the textbooks say more quietly. The ethnic map mattered too, not as a cause, but as a constraint. It defined the space of possible outcomes once the decision to dissolve the federation had been made. When the European community recognized Slovenia and Croatia as independent states in January 1992, it accepted the principle that the internal republican borders of Yugoslavia would become international borders. The Badinter Commission, the legal body advising the peace conference, had already ruled that this was the appropriate principle. The problem was that those borders had been designed as internal administrative lines in a federation, not as ethnic boundaries. They had been designed, specifically, to not be ethnic boundaries. In Croatia, the Krajina region had a Serb majority. When Croatia became independent within its republican borders, that majority suddenly found itself a minority in a new state, a state in which Croatian nationalism, suppressed for decades, was now the dominant political force. In Bosnia, no community had a majority. The 1991 census showed 44% Bosniak, 33% Serb, 17% Croat, with the communities geographically interleaved in a pattern that the ethnographic map showed clearly and that no clean border could separate. The decision to recognize republican borders as international borders was made without a serious analysis of what those borders contained. The ethnographic map existed. It was available. The demographic complexity of Bosnia in particular was well documented. The recognition happened anyway. And the war that followed was, among other things, the war that the ethnographic map had been predicting for 40 years. To understand what the ethnographic map of Yugoslavia was showing, you have to understand what an ethnographic map actually is, and what it cannot show. An ethnographic map records the geographic distribution of ethnic identity at a specific moment in time. It places a color on a piece of geography to indicate which ethnic group is numerically dominant in that area. It is a compressed version of census data, translated into visual form. What it cannot show is the internal complexity of the areas it colors. In Bosnia, in 1991, no municipality in the Republic had a population that was more than 80% of a single ethnic group in most areas. The map, depending on how it was drawn, showed a mosaic, patches of Muslim majority here, Serb majority there, Croat majority in another region, mixed municipalities scattered throughout. But the mosaic concealed another layer. Within each municipality, the villages were often more ethnically homogeneous than the municipality as a whole. And within each village, the households were often more homogeneous than the village. This nested structure, mixed at the republic level, mixed at the municipality level, less mixed at the village level, meant that any attempt to draw ethnic borders in Bosnia would require choosing which level to honor. A border drawn at the republic level would leave large populations of each group inside a territory nominally assigned to another. A border drawn at the village level would create a map that looked like a Rorschach test. Thousands of tiny enclaves, each requiring its own administrative infrastructure and its own border crossings. There was no clean ethnic border available in Bosnia. The ethnographic map showed this clearly. What it showed was not which group should control which territory. It showed that the concept of ethnic territorial control was fundamentally inapplicable to the demographic reality of Bosnia as it existed in 1991. The Bosnian War was not fought over the clean ethnic map that the international community sometimes imagined existed and needed to be sorted out. It was fought, and won for those who won it, to create the clean ethnic map that had not existed before the war. The 1991 pre-war census recorded 109 municipalities in Bosnia. In many of them, no single group had a clear majority. The 2013 post-war census showed dramatically different numbers. Groups that had been minorities in 1991 had disappeared from many municipalities, replaced by near total domination of a single community. The war transformed the mixed map into the sorted map. The ethnographic map of 1991 showed a complex, interwoven demographic reality. The ethnographic map of 2013 showed the outcome of a war designed to simplify that reality by moving or eliminating the people who made it complex. And then compare the front lines of the Bosnian War with the ethnographic map of 1991. The areas that became Republic of Srpska, the Serb entity established by the Dayton Agreement, correlate with the areas that had higher Serb population concentrations in 1991. The areas that remained under the Bosniak-Croat Federation correlate with the areas that had higher Bosniak and Croat concentrations. The war followed the map. The war also produced a new map. And the new map, the post-Dayton, post-ethnic cleansing map, is the one that the international community then recognized as the basis for political arrangements. This is what the ethnographic map of 1991 was predicting, not the war itself, but the shape of the outcome if the Federation dissolved and the Republican borders became international borders. The map knew the question. The war was the answer. Yugoslavia was not the only place where the gap between administrative borders and demographic reality produced violence when the administrative structure collapsed. It was one of the clearest cases in modern history of a problem that recurs wherever political borders are drawn through mixed populations. And then those borders become the basis for independent states. The partition of India in 1947 was planned along religious lines. Muslim-majority areas would become Pakistan. Hindu-majority areas would remain India. The planners, Cyril Radcliffe, who drew the Radcliffe Line in 5 weeks without ever having visited the region, had access to census data. The census showed that Punjab and Bengal, the two provinces being divided, were not cleanly separable. Both had Muslim and Hindu populations, interwoven at the district level. Radcliffe drew a line through them anyway. The line was announced on August 17, 1947, 2 days after independence. Between 200,000 and 2 million people died in the violence that followed, as populations moved to be on the right side of a border drawn through the middle of communities where they had lived together. The ethnographic map had shown the complexity. The political decision ignored it. In Cyprus, in 1974, the Turkish military intervention and the subsequent de facto partition of the island produced a line, the Green Line, that divided communities which had been mixed at the village level throughout the island's history. The forced population transfers that followed created 2 ethnically homogeneous zones out of what had been a mixed society. The partition that the ethnographic map had not predicted, because the mixing had been too complete, was produced by the war, not by the pre-war demographic reality. In Rwanda in 1994, the ethnic map was a product of colonial administration. The Belgian colonial census of 1933 had required every Rwandan to carry an identity card, specifying whether they were Hutu or Tutsi, categories that had previously been fluid social identities, not fixed biological ones. The census hardened the categories. The hardened categories became the basis for political mobilization. The political mobilization produced the genocide. The pattern across all these cases is consistent. A diverse population lives in a mixed demographic reality. An administrative structure, colonial, imperial, communist, or otherwise, draws borders that do not match ethnic distributions or imposes categories that harden previously fluid identities. When the administrative structure weakens or collapses, the gap between the borders and the demography, or the imposed categories and the social reality, becomes the site of political conflict. The ethnographic map predicts the sites of conflict. It does not predict the conflict itself. The conflict requires political actors who choose to mobilize ethnic identity. It requires the failure of institutions that might have managed the transition. It requires external powers that recognize borders without reading the maps those borders contain. The map shows the geography of vulnerability. What happens in that geography depends on choices that the map cannot predict. But the map is almost always there, available, showing the complexity that the political decision is about to simplify by force. The specific mechanism by which the ethnographic map of Yugoslavia was ignored, and what that ignoring produced, has 3 components worth understanding precisely. The first is the legibility problem of the political map. Political maps show borders as clean lines. An international border on a map is a definitive feature. It divides the space completely, assigning every square kilometer unambiguously to one state or another. Political maps are designed for clarity. They are designed to show the world as it is administered, not as it is lived. Ethnographic maps show gradients, mixtures, contested zones, transitional regions. They are less satisfying visually. They resist the clean demarcation that political maps require. When political actors and international negotiators work from political maps, which they almost always do, they are working from a representation of the world that suppresses demographic complexity in favor of administrative clarity. The political map shows the Republican border of Bosnia as a clean line. The ethnographic map shows what is inside that line. Working from the political map, the temptation is to treat the Republican border as if it were already an ethnic border. It was not. The second component is the sequential logic of recognition. The international community recognized the independence of Slovenia first, in January 1992, because Slovenia was the clearest case. Slovenia had a Slovene majority of approximately 90%. Its Republican border was close to an ethnic border. Recognition there was relatively unproblematic. The recognition of Croatia was more complex. Croatia's Republican border contained a Serb minority of approximately 12%, concentrated in the Krajina. But the principle that had been established, Republican borders become international borders, was now in operation. Recognition of Croatia came anyway. By the time Bosnia declared independence, the principle was fully established, and the alternative, negotiating new borders, was politically impossible. The complexity that the ethnographic map showed in Bosnia was acknowledged but not addressed. Recognition came in April 1992. The war began the same month. Each recognition was justified by reference to the principle established by the previous recognition. The principle was established in the case where it was least problematic. By the time it reached the case where it was most problematic, it was already international policy. The third component is the map that the war produced. The Dayton Agreement of 1995 ended the Bosnian War by recognizing a political reality that the war had created. A Bosnia divided between the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republika Srpska, with borders corresponding roughly to the military front lines at the moment of ceasefire. Those front lines corresponded, broadly, to the ethnic distribution shown on the pre-war ethnographic map, but amplified, cleaned, and simplified by ethnic cleansing. The mixed municipalities of 1991 had, by 1995, been sorted. The people who had made them mixed had been killed, expelled, or fled. The Dayton map is a cleaner map than the 1991 census map. It shows borders that correspond more closely to ethnic distributions. It was produced by the war, and the Dayton map is what the international community then recognized and worked to stabilize, which means that the international community, having failed to read the pre-war ethnographic map carefully enough to prevent the war, ended by endorsing the outcome that the war had produced. The map that the war drew is now the political reality. The map that existed before the war, the complex, mixed, interwoven demographic reality of Yugoslavia, is now history. The war was how the political map caught up with the ethnographic map's predictions. There is a village in Bosnia called Ahmići. In the 1991 census, it had a population of approximately 800 people. The village was mixed. Bosniak and Croat families had lived there together in the same settlement for generations. The houses were not segregated. The communities were not separated. People knew each other by name. On April 16, 1993, Croatian forces entered Ahmići and killed approximately 120 people. The victims were almost all Bosniak. The village was burned. The attack was planned and systematic. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia later found that the attack on Ahmići was part of a campaign to ethnically cleanse the Lashva Valley of its Bosniak population. Several Croatian military commanders were convicted of war crimes in connection with the massacre. On the pre-war ethnographic map, Ahmići showed as a mixed village in a mixed region. On the post-war ethnographic map, the Lashva Valley shows as predominantly Croatian. The map predicted the vulnerability. The massacre produced the new map. This is what the ethnographic map cannot show: the individual households, the specific families, the particular lives that will be destroyed when the gap between the demographic reality and the political border is closed by force rather than by negotiation. The map shows a color on a geographic area. It does not show the 800 people who lived in Ahmići in 1991. After every partition, after every ethnic cleansing, after every war fought along ethnic lines that the ethnographic map had shown were blurred and complex, the political map produced by the conflict is cleaner than the one that preceded it. The new map looks like what the politicians said it should look like before the war started. The complexity that made the old map difficult to read has been simplified. This simplification is what 140,000 people in Yugoslavia died to produce. Demographers, geographers, historians who study these maps and their relationship to violence have noted a disturbing regularity. The demographic maps produced by post-conflict settlements, partition agreements, peace treaties, population transfers, tend to resemble the ethnic maps that nationalists drew before the conflict as their ideal outcome. The war was the instrument of the cartographic revision. The pre-war ethnographic map showed a complex reality that defied clean political borders. The post-war political map showed clean borders that the war had made correspond to demographic reality by removing the people who complicated it. We read the post-war map and see stability. We see borders that correspond to where people live. We see a situation that seems, however unfortunately, to have resolved itself. What we do not see, because it is no longer on the map, is the mixed village of Ahmići as it existed in 1990. The map that would have shown us that village is the map that the war destroyed. And the map that replaced it, the clean map, the sorted map, the map that looks like what the nationalists wanted, is the map we use when we try to understand what happened. We navigate by the map that the killing made. We have almost forgotten that there was another map before it.